there's versions of this talk before. If you want to run and go and get some wine instead, then people feel free to do so. Also, I was thinking about tying my laptop with Ursuline's thread. I'm going to kind of move around a bit because it turns out that my glasses are not really good enough to read my print on. But as we'll see, according to Borse's selective effects account, it's not clear whether or not I'm biologically dysfunctional or not, given that these glasses no longer work properly for me because they have pre-pandemic glasses. Anyway, this talk is going to be a little bit different. I'm afraid I'm not going to talk very much about pregnancy, but I am aiming to talk about pregnancy in the last third or so. So I apologize if I go a little bit quickly, because I feel like I definitely don't want to kind of miss out. I don't want to finish. I don't want to cut out my last few slides and then I haven't said anything about pregnancy at all. But I'm going to be talking about an issue in philosophy of medicine and then applying what I say to the case of pregnancy, which I take to be interesting because I think it's difficult. Okay, so my aim is to defend a prominent view on disease, Christopher Borse's biostatistical account of disease or pathology. I'm only aiming to defend it against objections related to choice of reference classes. Oh, and so I'm also going to be criticising some of Ursuline's work in a previous life in 2007. So I'm going to be defending it against criticisms that Ingler's made of Borse's account. And similar things, but I think less clearly stated, have been said by Rachel Cooper previously. So there are other objections, but I'm not going to talk about those at all. I'm just to defend Borse against the reference class objection. So my claim is going to be that natural selection theory can yield broad, non-arbitrary reference classes, contrary to Ingler's worry. And I think that Borse is mostly vindicated when it comes to the reference class issue. But I think that my defense highlights some tricky aspects of thinking about pregnancy and what counts as normal during a pregnancy, what counts as dysfunction during a pregnancy. So it's not clear to me that the BST can cope with this common biological state. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, actually. So Borse calls it the biostatistical theory of disease. I think it's more like a biostatistical conception of disease or a kind of disease, but it's always labeled as a theory of disease, or Borse labels it as such. Borse's aim is to give an objective, naturalistic definition of what it is for someone to be diseased. I think what I'm saying will remain relevant if you didn't like a naturalist account that said that biological dysfunction was necessary and sufficient for something to be a disease. If you just think that biological dysfunction is necessary for something to be a disease, maybe you think it also has to be harmful. What I'm talking about here can feed into that necessary component. So you needn't be committed to Borse's more kind of hardline naturalist position. You could be somebody like Wakefield, who thinks that that diseases are harmful dysfunctions. So I'll read the quotes, but then this is my gloss to try to kind of summarize what Borse is getting at. So Borse says the fundamental idea is that a pathological condition is a state of statistically species subnormal biological part function. He goes on in a more recent piece of work, a normal function of a part or process within members of the reference class is a statistically typical contribution by it to their individual survival or reproduction. But the basic idea is that biological function, if we want to find out what if we want to look for biological functions, we need to look for things which are contributing to the organism's goal of survival or reproduction. And then the statistical bit is that what counts as normal is what turns out to be typical. Well, that's what makes it a statistical theory. So this is my example, not Borse's. I'm not. My philosophy of medicine students get kind of burdened with various kind of accounts of my ailments, and we can illustrate example. I'll just give you one. So the way it would go for my hip function is my right hip's function is to facilitate walking via its ability to rotate. Since that's my right hip's contribution to survival and/or reproduction. There's a typical range of hip motion. When I say there's a typical range of hip motion. Sorry, so there's a typical range of capacity to rotate the hip. That marks out for Borse what's normal hip rotation. If my hip rotation capacity to rotate falls outside that typical range, then my hip is pathological, it's dysfunctional, and hence I'm diseased, according to Borse. As I said, Borse thinks that dysfunction is necessary and sufficient for something to be a disease, and his claim is that it's an objective matter of biological fact. So the reference classes. Oh, I've got unapologetically unattractive slides. I've got two images which are kind of deliberately silly, but they're kind of leading up to an image which makes what I think is really important and overlooked issue, I think. So reference classes. So Borse says that what counts as normal height is typical height, but clearly statistical typicality is going to depend on the way in which you carve up objects in the world into classes. We could talk about what the typical height of objects in London is. That's clearly not what Borse is getting at. That's clearly the wrong reference class. So that's a ridiculous non-starter. We could talk about the typical height of Homo sapiens in my house. That's not going to be a non-starter. We could talk about London. That's not what Borse is getting at. So this is a precursor to what Borse thinks are the correct reference classes. For Borse, the kind of statistical typicality he's interested in is what's the typical height of maybe a 20 to 60-year-old male Homo sapien. When I say maybe, I just mean those numbers. There's room to wonder what these numbers should be. So Borse thinks that the natural, what he repeatedly refers to as natural reference classes, the natural reference classes when it comes to organisms are species, sex, and age. He rose back on the age thing. I'm not really going to talk about that, but it might come up in questions. But he thinks that the correct reference class is to narrow down organisms according to species, sex, and age. So to illustrate those, so I don't have atypical menstrual cycles because I'm relative to the sex reference class, but if I was a different biological sex, then I might have them. A 2-year-old female Homo sapien who hasn't begun menstruating is not atypical. A 25-year-old Homo sapien with joint inflammation of degree X may be atypical. And then an 80-year-old Homo sapien with hip joint inflammation of degree X might be statistically typical. And according to the BST, these are going to be cases of abnormality or normality, depending on the typicality. So the reference class objections. So the basic worry is from Kingma and Cooper is that in fact the choice of reference classes is not an objective matter of biological fact. It kind of breaks the naturalism or the supposed naturalism credentials. So the choice of reference classes is not objective, and then a kind of domino effect. So hence what is typical is not objective. Hence what's normal is not objective according to the BST. Hence what is a disease is no longer objective according to the BST. So Kingma 2007, is that what it is to be healthy? Kingma doesn't use the word arbitrary, but I think the quote in the next slide or two kind of does point in that direction. So Kingma worries about arbitrariness or even potential circularity when it comes to choosing reference classes in medicine. Cooper raises issues regarding reference classes. Cooper's worried about, Cooper worries that race classifications should be included, and also worries about a general concern that people have with reference classes, which is that they can kind of collapse down into single cases and the statistics kind of disappear. As I said, there are other objections to the BST that I'm setting to one side. Relatively recent paper by Griffiths and Mathewson argues that the reference class problem is one of the two most persistent objections to Bourse's account. The other one they think is a persistent objection is what gets sometimes referred to as a universal disease objection, which is the idea that if we all suffer from gum inflammation, I mean, all Homo sapiens suffer from it. It could come out that none of us are suffering from a disease on the BST account, and that's totally counterintuitive. In fact, that universal disease objection is closely related to the reference class problem. Because it might turn out that prostate cancer beyond a certain age becomes universal, close to universal, and so it no longer is a disease on ground that is universal. We're right in the area of the reference class problem there. So I'll say a bit more about Elson's objection. So this is from what it is to be healthy. So this is a really strong claim, I take it. I've argued that there are no facts that determine which reference classes are appropriate. These are my examples now, this isn't the quote. A natural class, so thing with worries that a natural class could include those with hypertension, those with hip impairment, those with diabetes, with cognitive impairments, and so on and so on and so on. So the idea, and then the worry would be that if these are bona fide natural classes, then people who have myopia or people who have hypertension will be statistically normal within the category of people who have hypertension, and now it comes out as being normal and hence not a disease, according to Bourse's account. As I said, Cooper focuses on race classifications. I mean, I'm not sure that Welsh is a race, but and there's various things to say. I mean, you can have a lot of skepticism about whether these are legitimate biological classifications, but that's the way that Cooper frames the worry. So here's my I used to have a picture of rats in previous version, and then I would make a kind of derogatory comment about the city that I was in, and that we were surrounded by lots of rats. My house has a rat infestation, so it seems a bit kind of mean. So this is my cat carrying a rat. We have various kind of bits of scuttling around between our floors. I think this is important. Neither Kingma nor Cooper consider the possibility of an arbitrariness when it comes to reference classes in a kind of blowing up direction, where the classes get larger than Bourse thinks is appropriate. Okay. I think, well, I don't know if that reflects the fact that in a wider literature, people have talked about reference class worries in various areas of philosophy, and the technical worry is often this collapsing to a single case. So it's the going downwards. But my heart is atypically slow relative to, my heart is atypically slow relative to all the mammals in my house. But it's atypically slow relative to the class all mammals, or rats, cats, and me. Okay, but really, of course, we'd be thinking about something like the class of all mammals. So I'm completely atypical when it comes to those kinds of biological classifications. So, but this is never mentioned. So I take it. So Kingma and Cooper tacitly accept that the species requirement is legitimate. That's unproblematic. But I think that if there's a genuine problem, then you would need to justify this one as well. So here's a more recent response from Bourse. It's not that recent anymore, but so Bourse says, as for choice of, so this is in direct response, I think, to Elson and to Rachel Cooper. They're both cited this paper as being the kind of canonical versions of the problem. So as for choice of reference class, the one that I suggested medicine uses, an age group of a sex of a species or subspecies, could hardly be a more biologically natural choice. Apart from one detail, I think the detail there is the age. Apart from one detail, the BST's reference class is just one morphological type in the smallest taxon to which an organism belongs. When biologists describe and classify organisms, they sort them into species or subspecies, separate them by sex in sexual species, and distinguish immature from adult forms. I mean, of course, that's true, but biologists also describe and classify organisms and sort them according to order or phylum or genus and kingdom and so on. And I think this points in the direction of what I want to argue, but I don't think this is very clear. If I was critical of Grose, I'd say really this is just a kind of restatement of what he said previously and pointing to the fact that what could be more natural. But I want to say something about why I think these are the right classifications, the right classes. So I think it does elaborate somewhat on what Grose means by natural class, but I think much of Kingma's critique is not really touched by that response, because most of Elsen's critique consists of various persuasive arguments against various explications of what a natural class is, which Grose has not given. So Grose does not really say what he means by a natural class. And then Elsen takes it as her job to kind of make various suggestions and then show ways in which they don't work. And I don't think Grose is actually, in that response, providing a clear explication of what he means by a natural class. Noticed, I think there's a possible source of kind of confusion or disagreement here. This is where, when he says that, as for the choice of reference class, the one that I suggested medicine uses, I'm not quite sure whether to read that as a description of a suggestion for what, as a matter of fact, doctors use, or a normative claim about what they should use. Okay, so this is just to draw the distinction between doing a kind of a descriptive philosophy of science versus a normative philosophy of science. I mean, what I think Elsen is interested in is that normative philosophy of science, which says this is how we should make the classifications. And Grose sometimes kind of wavers, because his response to Cooper's kind of silly examples to do with being Welsh is to say, well, that's ridiculous, like no doctor uses that. But I take it that doesn't really get to the heart of the problem if what you think you're doing is a kind of normative problem. And there are various things that Grose says that make it seem as if that is what he's interested in. But there's a bit of kind of movement. But because I take it that it seems completely plausible that it's correct that this is how medicine starts to classify organisms when it talks about what's normal. Okay. Note another example. That said, that it's how classification is made. The example I'd always give to students is going in for the most recent health check I've had, getting a cholesterol test. The cholesterol test comes back. The doctor says, "Oh, your cholesterol level is well, this is normal, I think, rather than." But we might, can you be typical? Like your cholesterol's normal, and I kind of relax and go, "Oh, great." And they say, "Oh no, but that's bad because almost everyone's got bad levels of cholesterol." Right. So now that might be a reference class issue to do with whether it's like the age factor, or it could just be that, like, literally in 21st century UK, having certain levels of cholesterol are normal, and doctors don't think that means that they're non-dysfunctional or non-disease states. But I take it that it does seem plausible that medicine, as a matter of fact, does carve up organisms and would talk about what's normal for your age and so on. Okay. Now is that 20? Is that 20? Okay. So biological naturalness. I think so. Kingma rightly rejects that something's natural because it occurs in nature. That seems kind of too permissive. She rules out normal, like, because that's to beg the question. She more plausibly, this I think is the most plausible candidate. Biological naturalness would be categories which are natural kinds. But then her reason for rejecting that is to say, on the basis that, so I think that so Down syndrome might be the most kind of stark or obvious case. It's plausible that, so you might think that, I mean, some people think there aren't such things as natural kinds in biology. But if you think that something like chromosome counts mark out natural kinds, then Down syndrome is going to mark out a natural kind as well. And similarly, I think, but maybe less in a less clear-cut sense, diabetes example and so on and so on. But my claim is that there's another place to look for natural biological classes, and that Borse has hinted at that place, but isn't explicit or precise enough. So I think we should look to biological theory, but we can't look to any old part of biological theory, and that's because of the title of this book. So physiological developmental biology. The title of this book, so a textbook on fetal development, is Essentials of Embryology and Birth Defects. So at this point in biological theory, we've already got the pathological thinking going into our talk and going into our kind of building of classifications into the world. So at that point, there is a risk of that kind of circularity problem that Kingma points to, I think. I think we need to look to a foundational area of biological theory that doesn't have the risk of these kinds of theory-laden classes, and that's the theory of evolution by natural selection. So this is the non-silly picture. So I tell you, the natural selection theory, within natural selection theory, function ascriptions are delivered by the theory, they're not assumed. I mean, there's debate about the right way to think about what counts as proper biological function, but the theory is one part of, one aspect of the natural selection theory is to try and work out what functions are. And within natural selection theory, certain classifications are deeply embedded in that theory. So it's completely, so Cooper and Cooper are right not to worry about the species classification. So the species taxon level, on whatever interpretation I think you have of what counts as a species, people will argue that the species taxon is sometimes it's called a privileged level. So there are people who are anti-realists about species, but then there'll be anti-realists about all the other levels as well. So there's something seen as special about 6 species taxa. These, as an objective, they're the objective groupings. Various arguments that the higher levels are not objective groupings. Evolution by natural selection acts on species. It acts on breeding populations, on gene pools. It's species that evolve. Higher taxa are not. So vets do not need to go around trying to fix penguins on the basis that they can't fly because they're atypical birds. So that's the serious version of the cat and the mouse, or the buildings in London. The other reference classes. So the sex class, reproduction is one component of fitness. Sexual reproduction is one way to do it. Sexual selection is at the core of natural selection theory where it exists. So there's the title of a relatively recent paper. It's extremely ancient. I don't think very much hangs on that. The important thing is it's at the foundations of the theory. In certain species, you need this classification in order to make predictions about changes in populations. Age, so life history theory is a core part of natural selection modeling. Life history theory is the analysis of kind of variation in strategies across a lifetime. Chronological age itself is not a fundamental category, although sometimes the categorization is according to age, but that's just a proxy. Really, these are life stages of organisms. So stages of infancy, being a juvenile, being an adult, these are related to trade-offs between the survival and reproduction components of fitness. We've also had that earlier quote of distinguishing immature from adults. So I take it that I want to argue that that classification according to life stage is again deeply embedded at the foundations of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So it's not an arbitrary choice. It's well motivated. In some organisms, senescence is recognized as a life stage. I won't say anything more about that. I think this is a problem case in Homo sapiens. I think senescence is tricky to work out what to say, but I'll leave that. I'll set that to one side. So I think that the legitimate BST claims take the form X is typical and therefore normal relative to juveniles or to adults, and so on and so on. And hence diseased or not, depending on whether typical for juvenile or for adult or not. So the critics are answered. I think they're broadly supported. So hypertension, diabetes, hypermobility, none of these kinds of things are classifications that are at the core of natural selection theory. It can yield broad and contrary to Cooper's worry about collapsing, non-arbitrary, contrary to Ingham's worries, classes. And they tend to coincide with Borsis stipulation. Okay, so what about pregnancy? Okay, so huge divergence in physiology within pregnancy compared to non-pregnancy. So profound anatomical and physiological changes, some of which persist across a lifetime, some of which don't. Metabolic rate increasing by 15%, heart rate 5 to 20 beats per minute higher. The heart is, quotes here from the same paper, the heart is pushed upwards, rotated forward with its left quarter laterally displaced. I take it that if my heart was like that, then yeah, that would be seen as being problematic, potentially. I don't know. This is a question mark. I mean, I just did kind of N of 1 survey with my partner on whether or not the kind of these physiological changes were on a par with the changes between being a juvenile and being an adult. And her answer was yes, massively. And I can't imagine that getting old will be as dramatic. But I don't know what other people who've got experience of pregnancy would say. Oh, and the list goes on. Oh, that illustrates, that quote, I think, illustrates sort of why this is, I think this is an interesting problem. That it may start to be difficult to work out what counts as dysfunction. Oh, no, sorry, this one, sorry, that quote, I take it. So the list could go on. So notice, of course, so we're interested in what's normal for pregnancy. There'll be normal variation within the class, within pregnant organisms. There'll be variation, and some cases I take it will be unproblematic. So if my partner was induced on the basis of blood pressure, like her blood pressure was kind of off the chart, whether it was the non-pregnancy chart, as it were, or the pregnancy chart. So some cases will have dysfunction whichever way the classification goes, but there will be cases where what's normal, that there will be cases where the normality judgment will depend on the reference class choice. It's worth saying, sorry, this isn't again for the first time, for a naturalist, nothing immediately follows from the question of whether or not something is a biological dysfunction and hence a disease. So if the verdict is that something is a disease, it doesn't immediately follow that there should be an intervention. If it turns out that something is not a disease state, it doesn't immediately follow that there should not be an intervention. But I take it that dysfunction judgments do play a role in intervention decisions. So this is where I'm not sure. Do pregnant Homo sapiens form a natural biological BST reference class? I take it they're often taken as such within medicine, and people do use the kind of phrasing normal for pregnancy. Of course, so I think my defense is kind of important, because if Edelstein was right that there's just no matter of fact, then we could just stipulate what counts as a reference class, and then, okay, well then we could just decide that we would include pregnant organisms as being their own special reference class. But my proposal is that it should be these classifications should be at the foundations of natural selection theory. I think pregnancy doesn't feature as a core class. Reproduction matters to natural selection theory, but as it were, the style of reproduction doesn't matter. So if being pregnant doesn't appear as a foundational class, then pregnant organisms would be included with all other adult females. Now, I mean, I've got this as a question mark. I mean, I think that that would be an unintuitive judgment, that the right reference class would be to lump together according to sex, but not according to pregnancy status. that might then be seen as, okay, if I've defended the force against the reference class problem, I've just highlighted a weakness in the BST and made it more clear that it can't, that it's giving the wrong judgment. Or you might think it's just an interesting insight that the BST gives you. So just having 1 second thought on that, and then I'll finish. I don't think I've been precise in what I mean by something which is a class which is at the foundations of natural selection theory. Okay? I pointed towards life history theory as the rich theory of lifetime reproductive fitness, where there are viability and fecundity components, and where sex and developmental stages are standard part of the modelling. And of course, Homo sapien pregnancy isn't found there. But we might include a fundamental, very common maybe being a gravid organism, where that can be filled in by various mechanisms. Oh, but I should say, I don't think I haven't been precise about what I mean about being at the foundations, but I think that various things are certainly not at the foundations, like having diabetes. So this kind of goes back to Margarita's talk. So these are all, I mean, most of these will be called pregnancy. I think the interesting kinds of cases would be the joey in the pouch and the bird that's actually still sitting on the eggs. I'm pushing the idea that this notion of a gravid state will be like a really broad one, and that pushes it down towards the foundation level. But so certainly this kind of carrying of offspring is a very common phenomenon, as is the existence of sex and of life stages. But Kingma rightly rejects the fact that something's common and occurs in nature as being the right way to think about this, and that wasn't my reasoning. I'm still pushed, I think, to thinking that I tend to conclude that this is not a foundational category, but I think I'm open to being persuaded. But either way, I don't think it's obvious whether it is or not. So I don't think the BST gives a clear answer about pregnancy. So it struggles to cope. I'll finish by saying I think the BST struggles to cope, but I think other naturalist accounts will struggle to cope as well. So I think pregnancy is going to be a difficult case for all sorts of versions of what it is for something to be a disease. So I think that a selected effects account will struggle to cope with the case of pregnancy for reasons that I could go into. I tend to be sympathetic to the naturalist approach, but thinking about pregnancy is the thing that's pushed me most towards what I would not have otherwise been pushed towards, which is Ereshevsky has this paper, which is a kind of eliminativist paper where he argues that we should just ditch thinking about disease and just go for state descriptions of physiological states and then attach to them value, whether or not they're valued or disvalued, and kind of get rid of the notion of dysfunction. And pregnancy is the one case that makes me sympathetic to that, where when I first read this, I was completely unsympathetic to it. So I've aimed to rebut the reference class objection to the biostatistical theory. Biological theory can yield objective, non-arbitrary natural classes. Not any old bit of biological theory, natural selection theory. Grose is broadly vindicated, but pregnancy is a difficult case, though it may be difficult for other accounts too. I'll stop there.
Let somebody else go for it first.
Okay. Thanks. I thought that was great. So what exactly is the problem with considering pregnancy a life stage? So I get that it's not a core feature of evolutionary theory, but it does have its own adaptations, and like the placenta, for example. And this is always going to be relative to the particular species, right? So, for example, some species have different larval stages, and the different larval stages are not core features of evolutionary theory, but they are obviously life stages of the species that do undergo those stages. So what's so different about pregnancy?
We have fetal stages, whereas some organisms don't have those kinds of stages. Yes. Well, so I guess the argument's going to go some, I mean, I'm trying to kind of go down your line, because like I said, I'm almost keen to be persuaded, I think, because I tend to think that it's unintuitive if the reference class goes in the direction I'm suggesting. So if I say something like, well, not all organisms do this kind of carrying, well, of course, not all organisms do sex. And not all of them have juvenile stages, and certainly not all of them have senescence. And so I think, yeah, okay, so I think that, so I don't immediately have that kind, I can't use that as a counter argument. I mean, that
Organisms that do have pregnancy as part of their reproductive strategy do have a life stage that is pregnancy.
yeah, and
Plausible.
I mean, there's a difference with the other kinds of life stages in that it's not a one-way process, but right, I mean, so it's like a fluctuation into and then out of this state on a relatively short time scale. But again,
There could be other examples of
I
that,
guess,
yeah.
I mean, you might be able to come up with examples where there's a developmental stage that something goes through and then it will shift back again. And then so there are weird kinds of cases, like Godfrey Smith talks about cases of ferns and so on that do all sorts that do what to us is very exotic. I sometimes have a quote from Godfrey Smith talking about, he calls it exotic or something in ferns, where they go through what to us seem like very strange states, where they move from being diploid to haploid.
They have alternation of generations, yeah. But those you could see as different organisms.
Well,
One haploid organism and a diploid one.
yeah.
But there are some jellyfish that might go from a polyp stage to a medusa stage and then go back and forth between those. Sorry? Yeah, the so-called immortal jellyfish.
Okay. I'd be interested, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I just want to clarify something, like what exactly you mean by the core fundamental theory or the core fundamentals of evolution, and why is, phenotype not a core fundamental feature of evolutionary theory? Why binocular vision not a core fundamental? Why is bipedalism, like mammals?
Well, I specifically mean core classes which are at the core. So I mean, so the concept of phenotype and genotype would be concepts that are at the core of
Yeah,
the selection theory, but they're not classes.
but binocular organisms is a class.
Yeah, well, then I take it that that's not a classification which is at the foundations.
Why?
Well, on the basis that, well, okay, so
What are these foundations like?
right, well, so fitness is going to be one of the core concepts,
Yeah,
and then immediately fitness is not there are immediately going to be two components of fitness, which are dependency and viability. And so sexual reproduction is one way of doing that reproduction. And so in sexual organisms, immediately it's not possible to kind of run the theory, anything. It's not possible to run any kind of prediction in natural selection theory without using that classification. Like you'll get nonsense. You get nonsense out if you don't classify in that way. Whereas there are all sorts of natural selection models which won't require distinguishing between binocular and monocular types because they don't exist. Like they're not relevant to those models. I mean, those are relevant applications for some models, but not generalized models. But the generalized models will have classifications according to cells. But
Yeah.
I take the point, as I said, I'm not. So
because not all organisms have developmental phases in
No,
this
they
way.
don't. Well, and most
you know.
organisms don't do sexual reproduction. Like if you're doing it on numerical count of the organisms that there are in the world, and I
Yeah.
guess on species as well. So yeah, this is, I mean, where sexual reproduction exists, it's. So I mean, I take it the reproduction, like the concept of reproduction, is even deeper, but the classification according to sex types is very, very low level. And as I said, I'm kind of acknowledging that I'm not able to give an answer as to exactly what's going to count, but the kinds of those high level classifications, including, I think, with, the number of eyes, is not, those definitely are not at the foundations of the field. But I think pregnancy kind of shows up the fact that there's going to be very difficult. There are difficult cases where it's not actually. I think it's not obvious. It's not clear cut.
Okay, thank you so much. So I have doubts if natural selection theory can really can be used as a reference class. It can be helpful because I think that many cases of, there'll be many cases of something like, for example, sickle cell trait. Like, okay, there is sickle cell anemia, right? And if you are homozygous for sickle cell anemia, you have a sickle cell trait. Is it an abnormality? I think it depends on the circumstances. I mean, for some groups of people living in for example, where malaria is endemic, for example, in endemic regions, it may be an advantageous trait and not an abnormality at all. But for other individuals who shift to other parts of the world, it may be an abnormality. And the same, for example, for all highly polymorphic genes, like, for example, those that code for major histocompatibility complex that I mentioned in my presentation, that basically they define our sensitivity to diseases, to infectious diseases in particular. So if you have a certain mutation, because you inherited it, for example, you may be prone to some kinds of infections. For example, I don't know, let's say streptococcal infections, but then you may become resistant to some type of viral infections that will put you in advantage. So my point is that it's like to have a useful reference class, I think you have to consider not just the species, sex, life stage, whatever, but in particular, the kind of context in which you live in given circumstances, and then you can decide, okay, this is an abnormality, this is not an abnormality. So I can also imagine somebody would, I don't know, they would miss their leg, for example, and it would not be an abnormality because in, I don't know, some very maybe bizarre case, we can imagine like a scenario in which it would be actually an advantage. So I don't think that reference class can be defined in that way in the outside of the like a relative context in which an individual, not the species, not the whatever natural selection theory can consider, find themselves, because it for a particular, that's my point. Thank you.
It's a couple of things there. So one is this is not proposing a selective effect of painful disease. So a rival naturalist version would be to say ditch all the statistics and just go for look at the adaptations in the world. I'm sorry, I should state this. Look at the adaptations in the world and the broken adaptations of the diseases, and various. I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to that view, but I take it. But I think what you're expressing there is a kind of an objection to that kind of approach. But that's not what I'm aiming to do here. This is just to look somewhere to ground the choice of classes, but it's not saying. It's remaining within the Bourse framework after that and saying, right, we'll just look at the statistics. Then some of the rest of what you were saying, I think, is pointing towards other objections to the BST, which do exist. So I think in the background there, that probably relates to other criticisms Elton has made of the BST, which are situation specific. Is that what's the phrase in the paper? situations for specificity, and so to argue that the kind of toy cases would be things like it's normal to, if you're poisoned, then it's normal to have, statistically typical to have certain kinds of biological parameters. So yeah, in the background, they would be other objections. Those are other good objections to the BST. But I'm definitely not. I'm not proposing a selected effects account. I think one weakness in what I'm proposing actually is someone might say, well, if you're going to go down that route, why not just propose the selected effects account? Like, why try to fix BORS by kind of naturally selecting up the category bit for BORS, but not go for the proposal that you're objecting to? Yeah. So I think that, but you wouldn't be happy with that, Jan.
That was my question. It seems to me this doesn't really count as a defense of the biostatistical theory, because if you're taking all that evolutionary stuff on board anyways, like, first of all, I think that's something Bose would be outraged by,
Yeah,
right?
Well, I don't know what I think this sounds quite. I think this is what I think this may be what he's getting at in that quote, but just doesn't express it.
I think there may be no kind of coherent explication of what he's getting at in that quote, like, without this, right? Without this, but that I still think that I would be very, very surprised if he was anywhere near willing to go down that road, and kind of for reasons that seem to me good, in the sense that you would end up with the sort of theoretical baggage of the selected effects view and the sort of theoretical baggage of the sort of BST view. And at that point, I guess, why not just sort of take the plunge? And I guess what I'm wondering is, why isn't this a defense of the selected effects view?
Well, so one is, so I don't know what Force would think of it, but it's true that he's strongly against a selected effects account of disease. So he's really, so he thinks that Wakefield is Wakefield has a hybrid view, dysfunction plus harm, but Wakefield wants to go for a selected effects account dysfunction, and Wakefield then gets criticised by Bors for having the wrong account of dysfunction, and then also gets criticised by kind of hardcore normativists for including the dysfunction bit. So Bors definitely won't like selected effects, but this is not a selected. It's not moving towards selected effects. If I wanted to be specific about why it's not, this is not a selected effects account. It's not. It's kind of. There's clear blue water, as it were. Sorry. It goes right back to the beginning. Right. So I want, right, to their individual survival or reproduction. So this is not, it's not a historical account. The selected effects account is a historical account about the past history of natural selection. And that this is, my proposal is a bolting on of considerations from natural selection theory. But this is what marks out Borse's account that's different from a selected effects account, because it's contribution to survival or reproduction, but it's contribution to my survival and reproduction. Whereas a selected effects account, it wouldn't matter. What matters to a selected effects account are kind of long-run trends of average fitness effects across populations across a lifetime. So, so I think it is a defense of the BST. But it's right that Bors does not like a kind of natural selecting up. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a selected effects account.
Yeah, I think this is a follow-up. I don't know enough about to several of the questions about this literature. So, I mean, obviously, like you talk about heart rate as one of the things, but obviously my heart rate goes up when I run around. So it's not, and I'm not there's nothing dysfunctional going on when it goes up when I'm exerting myself, right? It's supposed to. So there's got to be some sort of understanding of like a contextual kind of element where it's like resting heart rate, yeah, but then when you're exercising, it's meant to go up, and both things we can assess whether it's normal for the reference class in the sense that you've given it. But then I don't see why we would need reproduction to be a life stage or anything, because when that happens, things are meant to work differently, right? Just as when I'm exerting myself, my heart's meant to be beating faster. So why wouldn't that be handled in just the way that we're going to handle sort of loads of things, right? Does that? Yeah.
So there's always going to be a kind of contextual dependence on some kind of background conditions, like whether or not you've been exerting yourself and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, because just, I mean, we're you know, some things I mean, we just do lots of stuff, right? And you measure whether things are doing what's normal for them to be doing when you're doing that thing. And I know that this might invite other worries, but you're going to have to do something like that, right? As long as we're talking about heart rate as something that can potentially be dysfunctional. So as soon as you have to do something like that, it might invite a worry about, like, well, why don't you do that for everything or something? I don't know how you resolve that. But given you have to, why you're gonna that same thing will handle reproduction, right? In some sense, in principle.
So I think this again is in the kind of area of this sort of situation specific.
Yeah.
What's been seen as an objection, the idea that what counts as typical is going to depend on contextual factors. I think that's often been taken as being a different objection to the reference class objection.
Yeah, I was thinking of it as friendly rather than an objection.
Kind of considerations have been formulated as an objection on the basis that you're always going to have to give more and more detail, and basically the statistics will just vary wildly depending on the context, and so there won't be an answer, or you'll get an unintuitive answer.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the thing is just like, well, you know, what determines what the part or process is like? That's like a generalization. What's that ranging over? Maybe that's where the question sort of goes, because there's like an implicit domain of quantification, the parts and processes, and it's like, well, one process is like you exerting yourself, or what your heart's doing when you're exerting yourself, and it's like, oh well, that's not a separate process.
Yeah, so something this may kind of relate to the question about how to individuate traits.
Yeah.
But the traits are likely to be kind of dispositional traits rather than like descriptions of each organism's activity at any particular moment. And it's not so.
Right. So if
one trait would be kind of capacity to increase heart rate when doing exercise would be one of the traits.
I'm going to suggest that we continue to talk because we're meant to be wrapping up now and we're ready.
No, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, Teresa, and I don't know your name. Okay. So Teresa.
I think the worry. I mean, I take the point. I think, but the worry would be that that would be kind of too permissive, because they'll just be everything.
But can we not say that there, as well as reference classes, when we have reference activity? If I'm training for a marathon on a regular basis, and if I'm currently engaging in gestation, then what happens when my body is not pathological? So rather than saying pregnancy or reference activity, it's something that enough humans are going to at some point, and then like that we can isolate.
Pregnancy is something more than maybe something like going for a run.
I think that's a very good sentence to finish your talk on. And can I encourage everyone to continue this after? Sorry to interrupt, Jonathan. I'm just aware of going over time too much, especially if people need to leave. But pregnancy is more than merely running. So I think that's nice. We'll be back here. For those of you who aren't coming for a drink, we'll be back here at 9 a.m. for coffee, 9:30 a.m. to start. Where there's only 3 talks tomorrow, and then I guess a lot of people go for lunch and whatever. Drinks in the room down there. Thanks for coming, and thank you, Jonathan, for a great talk.